So we all know and love the Mark IV Toyota Supra for being one of the most legendary cars with one of the most legendary engines from Japan of all time, right? And due to its legendary status within the car community, the prices for that Supra are higher than just buying a Mark V Supra at this point. So you may be thinking that all hope is lost for you if you ever want to be able to experience the over-engineering of Toyota in the 90s. But what if I were to tell you that there's another car out there for much cheaper with all the same bells and whistles? Well, there is, and it goes by the name Toyota Supra. The Toyota Supra was introduced into the world in 1980 and essentially was Toyota's halo car, meaning that they introduced the world to technology that Toyota had not yet put on any of their other cars. And then they saw how successful those technologies were on the Supra, and they brought them to the other cars if they were successful or not. The first generation of the Supra, or Z10, which is the chassis code the Japanese will commonly use to not get confused with other generations of Supra, flew onto the market in 1981. And like I said before, it had tons of new features that have never been seen before, some of which was a touchscreen air conditioning unit and a digital tachometer display that uses LEDs in the 80s with a Japanese compact car. Think about that. Now you may be questioning why I called it a compact car just then when these are some very long boys, and that's because Toyota followed the rules in Japan and played by the books, and they gave the car a 3-liter inline 6 which managed to make a very nice 187 horsepower. And with that very small engine size, the car was just right to be able to be labeled as a compact in Japan in order to help buyers save money on taxes, which is just a jolly good thing to do, Toyota, trying to save your customers some money. And from the very start, Toyota's idea behind this car was to make a luxury GT coupe, which people usually will compare to the 8 Series BMW of the time, because just like the 8 Series, Toyota would take all the comfort of their luxury models but make a much more appealing sporty car to cram it in, meaning that you really do get the best of both worlds. This car had 7-way adjustable leather seats, air brake assist, cruise control, and automatic warning lights were all standard on the first generation Supra, and while that may be common today, it most certainly was not common in the 80s. And due to all the technological advancements and price of this car, the critics and people alike loved it so much that it won Japan's Car of the Year award in 1981, which is the year it debuted, which in my personal opinion is very well deserved. So Toyota had an absolute winner on their hands, and they knew that. They didn't want this car to just be a thing of the past. So only 5 years after the release of the Z10, the Z20, or the second generation Supra, was released to the public. New Supra誕生. And the reviews were almost exactly the same. Personally, I think that's because the car looked pretty damn similar, so most people didn't bat an eye. But if you look at it a bit closer, you can easily see the styling differences in this generation. It was way more rounded with a much more narrow body to it, while also getting rid of all the random sharp lines, and in my opinion, they absolutely nailed it with the looks. But the engine was also a massive increase from the previous generation. This generation was built on the A70 Supra platform, or the Mark III Supra platform, which helped it handle very well for a pretty large luxury car. And on top of that, remember how I said before they used this car to introduce the world to new Toyota tech? Well, this was the very first mass-produced car to be equipped with air suspension, buddy old pal. That's right, air suspension in a freaking Toyota Supra. Now, it isn't the same air suspension that you probably think about. No, you can't just slam this car with a push of button from factory and be a hot boy and get 10,000 followers on Instagram. But it was cool nonetheless, and definitely paved the way for all the air suspension that we see today. On top of that, Toyota was still not done improving. Toyota was like Stranger Things. It just kept getting better and better, and they introduced the 7M GTE engine for the Z20 Supra, which was a 3-liter turbocharged inline 6 that managed to go from 187 horsepower in the first generation to a mind-boggling 240 horsepower in the second generation, which was a massive increase. But unfortunately, due to this increase in engine size and power, they were no longer able to be labeled as a compact car in Japan, and therefore they couldn't save money on taxes for the common folk, meaning that sales were not as high as Toyota thought they would be. But luckily for us, Toyota came up with an amazing idea. One dude at the Toyota dealership was like, hey, so you know how we just like launched Lexus in America to sell all of our big bulky luxury cars to Americans? Well, why don't we make a new generation of Soarer and sell it to the Americans, and all we gotta do is make the name have some big numbers in it and they're gonna eat it up. And so that's exactly what they did. In 1991, the most popular Soarer model came onto the scene and was an absolute hit in the Americas, selling right around 100,000 models in the United States with a price tag of $90,000 in today's money, during a time that most Americans were still getting accustomed to Japanese sports cars, which in my opinion is a massive success. The 350Z came out in 2003 and only sold a total of 150,000 models, and that was a much more affordable car, and it was much later into the America's lifespan when people were buying Japanese cars. So 100K models with a price tag of 90K in America during the 90s, that's pretty good. Now, for the looks, they completely redesigned the car. The 90s were here, and it was time for some curves, ladies and gentlemen. They made it much more round, maybe a little bit too round, depending on who you ask, and they made it incredibly long while still being quite narrow, giving it a very sporty, yet classy look to it, and people absolutely ate that up. This is by far the most popular and most successful generation of Soarer, and it's not just because of the looks either. The engine and platform that it rode on was now even better, and we were given a good amount of options, all of which were pretty damn good too. In America, we had the Lexus Sc430, which had access to a 2JZ GE. That is a 3-liter inline-6 that managed to make a nice 222 horsepower. This car was called, for a chassis code by the way, the JZZ31 Soarer in Japan, and it was the base model for them. In America, we also got access to the Sc400, which was equipped with a 1UZ FE, which is a gas-guzzling 4-liter V8 that made a nasty 263 horsepower. This car in Japan was called the UZZ32. And finally, in Japan only, they also got the legendary 1JZ GTE, which is quite literally the 2JZ GTE's little brother. It was a 2.5-liter twin turbocharged inline-6 that made, quotation marks on that, 276 horsepower, but due to the gentleman's agreement, most people think that number was actually much higher, probably closer to the Mark IV Supra's horsepower number of 320. Now, you may be running to Google to see if the 1JZ is actually a good motor, and I can assure you, it is. Most people nowadays looking at swapping their motor with a Toyota over-engineered motor actually lean towards getting a 1JZ over a 2JZ because the power potential is almost exactly the same. No, you can't get a 1JZ to 1000 horsepower without touching the internals like you can in the 2J, but most people say that you can get it up to 800 horsepower without touching them, which makes sense. The 1JZ was a whole half a liter smaller than the 2JZ, so obviously it won't be able to hold as much power. But either way, the 1J is still an incredibly slept-on motor from Toyota, and they crammed it into a car which was also very slept on, leaving the whole Soarer line as a car that only the deepest of JDM fans love. On top of that, they crammed this incredibly tunable motor into a car with all the bells and whistles of a luxury car, an S-Class Mercedes level car, but with a freaking 1JZ in it that can reach 800 horsepower without having to open up the motor. It is literally a Supra in a tuxedo. It has all the fancy bells and whistles. I'm gonna go to brunch with my friend Jeremy, and we're gonna get $500 mimosas and $10,000 steaks. But also on the inside, it's got, yo, my name's Kyle, and I represent Monster Energy, and it's freaking cool. Now, yes, there was one more generation of Soarer, and in America, it was called the Lexus Sc430, but we are not going to talk about that one because, well, it was a massive failure and it looked horrible, and I don't want to tarnish the wonderful Soarer name with that just abomination of a car. So if we can all just forget that the Sc430 even exists, I would greatly appreciate it.
Sorry.
So yes, there is another car out there that was as good as the Supra, and it is still relatively cheap today. Well, as cheap as a 90s JDM import can be, and it's the car that your grandpa used to drive to bingo every night. I hope I made you realize the true potential behind the Soarer and Sc300/400 cars, and if there's anything you take away from this video, it is to never, ever judge a book by its cover, because underneath that cover could be a roaring 1JZ. But ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. This is, like, I guess part 2 to a new series. I don't even know what I'm going to call this series, but it's going to be a series where I just go over, like, the history of cars and what makes them so great and all that stuff. You guys loved the Prelude one. You absolutely ate the Prelude video up. So hopefully you guys like this one as well. I think the next one is actually going to be on the Lamborghini Murcielago. I know it's weird. I don't usually talk about, like, exotics on this channel, but I really like the Murcielago. Like, it's one of my favorite supercars of all time. And I do love JDM cars, you guys know that, but I really like all kinds of cars, man. So I really want to start branching off and talking about more than just Japanese sports cars. So I hope you guys understand, and I hope you guys support the Murcielago video just as well as you're going to support this one and the Prelude one, because we all love cars, man, and it's time to stop, like, restricting yourself to only one country of cars. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Das Vidania. Have a nice night.